When I was in 7th grade, I decided I wanted to be an architect, which was a little strange because I didn't really know what good architecture was. I grew up in the country, 3 miles outside of a small farm town in Kansas. We lived in a crappy ranch-style house whose unfinished basement would flood every time there was a big rain. The only nice thing about our house was the property around it. My dad spent his money acquiring bits of farmland around our house and planting native prairie grasses and dozens, if not hundreds, of trees until he had coaxed together some sort of semi-forest. By the time I was in high school, he had created a miniature wildlife refuge full of pheasant and deer. Nonetheless, something about designing buildings appealed to me, and so my mom, a landscape designer, asked an architect that she knew in a nearby town if he would work with me on a summer project. Like a lot of middle schoolers growing up in the Bible Belt, I was kind of a religious kid. I went to youth group once a week and all that, and so when he asked me what I wanted to design, I said a church. I spent that whole summer in that unfinished basement sketching ideas, drawing elevations, floor plans, and meticulously crafting this foam core board scale model. And I quickly realized that I was not cut out to be an architect. First, there was way too much math. Second, I wanted to be running around outside, not stuck indoors. I wanted to run around, climb trees, or more often than not, plant and water them. Thank you, Dad. And so I abandoned the model completely, halfway finished, which was, in retrospect, for the best, because I look at the design now and it's bad. It's a triangle for no apparent reason. And more importantly, and this I wouldn't realize until later, it was completely devoid of context. We never talked about where the church would be. I'd drawn a shape and filled it with chairs and a stage, but good architecture is always about place. So I eventually studied journalism and became a writer, but I never lost my interest in design, and I've been thinking and writing about the built environment ever since. Well, not long ago, Lisa from FLUX asked me if I would contribute to the magazine's Sacred Spaces issue, and I immediately thought of the Thurston Memorial Chapel at Punahou. Now, if we have any Punahou grads here, you'll know that space extremely well. You've been required to go there once a week for all of your schooling. Others of you may not even know Punahou has a chapel. It's a remnant of its missionary history. I first saw the building a number of years ago when a friend took me on a tour of the campus, and it's instantly eye-catching, not because it's flashy, but for the opposite reason. It feels genuinely rooted in the ground. It's almost more of a natural feature than a building. The chapel itself is small and square, with a copper roof that you can see from quite a ways away across a grassy quad right there in the center of campus. The walls are white plaster. There's just a few thin bands of stained glass, and there's a single copper cross on the exterior. At the base is a lily pond that wraps around two sides of the building like some sort of truncated moat. The water lapping up at the sides of the building like the ocean against chalky white sea cliffs. Now, if you know Punahou's history, you know that that lily pond is a place of deep significance. It predates the school and is fed by a spring, which has more than one legend associated with it. In the most well-known, it concerns an elderly couple. They live on the slopes of what is now Punahou's campus, there at the mouth of the Manoa Valley. It's a time of severe drought and famine. The old couple is forced to forage food from wherever they can find it and walk for miles to gather what little water there is. And one night, a figure visits the woman in her sleep. He tells her to uproot the old hollow tree near their home, and she'll find water. She wakes up, she tells her husband, who, predictably, doesn't listen. Until that night, the same figure appears to him, tells him the same thing. When he wakes up and realizes that it's more than a dream, they tear the tree out by the roots, and fresh water gushes out of the ground. And they call the place Punahou, the new spring. Now, this legend and the spring was already at the core of the school's identity when in the 1960s it hired Vladimir Osipov to design it a chapel. Osipov, obviously, at this time is Hawaii's preeminent modern architect. He's revered, he's well-respected, and yet when he presents his idea for the chapel in 1964, it is radical. It was assumed that the chapel would be somewhere near the spring, the spiritual heart of the campus, but he proposed that the chapel not just be near the lily pond, but in the lily pond. He presented drawings with it sunken below the water's surface. Not only that, but the water would flow inside the building through a raised section of the exterior wall. The trustees apparently caught the vision, and not long after, a retaining wall is built. They pump the water out. The foundation is carefully sited so as not to damage the spring, and in 1967, the chapel opens its doors. 50 years later, it's regarded as one of Osipov's best works. As Dean Sakamoto put it, Thurston Chapel is inextricable from its site and the legend that resides there. It is at once Hawaiian, modern, and timeless. But is it sacred? That's the question that I wanted to answer. So a few months ago, I attended a chapel service there. It was a Monday morning. I got there at 7:30 a.m. when the air was cool and the campus was still relatively quiet. And to actually enter the chapel, you walk to one side, up a set of concrete steps, and under a trellis covered in bright, flowering bougainvillea. And you emerge first in a courtyard. It's ringed by ferns and shaded by a giant monkey pod tree. And instantly, the rest of campus feels far, far away. This is highly intentional. This whole arrival sequence is part of the architecture, carefully choreographed to create a sense of calm and a sense of intimacy. And from the courtyard, you also notice, though, that the building is different. On this side of the building, the roof is no longer copper, but it's warm ceramic tile. Instead of sheer faces, there are deep eaves that seem to draw you down another set of steps and into and through heavy koa wood doors. Inside, a set of pews are arranged around a coral altar, and there's the same hushed reverence, even that Monday morning, with the pews filled with a bunch of 4th and 5th graders. The service itself started like any other: somber organ music, ceremonial lighting of some candles. But then the kids burst into Hawaii Aloha, led by this jubilant chaplain with an acoustic guitar. Then there's the Lord's Prayer, but it's peppered with Hawaiian words. Then there's hula. Then there's chants, one of them dedicated to Pele, the goddess of fire. The kids are quizzed on stars and the name of the Polynesian navigator who first discovered and named the Hawaiian Islands. This all felt a bit surreal. After all, it was not that long ago that Punahou's missionary founders had banned practices like hula and the Hawaiian language. And yet here students were singing to a Hawaiian deity in a Christian chapel beneath a wooden cross. I don't want to sugarcoat the sometimes troubled history that Punahou and other institutions have had when it comes to race and religion. And later I was told that that service was somewhat atypical. Nonetheless, I couldn't help but feeling in that moment that Osipov had somehow intuited this future, and that the place had been designed to hold disparate ideas about God and what we believe to be sacred. At the dedication ceremony in 1967, he had said that he hoped students in need of spiritual and physical shelter would naturally gravitate toward the chapel, and that having come there, they would find the solace that they sought. For him, the space was a safe space for all students, regardless of their religious beliefs. Happens to all of us, apparently. It's really on a roll. For him, it was a safe space for all students. Sakamoto used the word timeless. But for me, in that moment, it felt boundless, rooted in something bigger than any one religion. I feel this feeling most strongly at the building's threshold. Unlike almost every other place of worship in the world, you descend into Thurston Chapel. The altar is at the lowest point of the building. This, again, was intentional. Osipov wanted to bring students and faculty as close to the source of the spring as he could. Although some may say that the building destroyed a portion of the pond, in reality, Osipov forged a new, more active relationship between the school and its namesake. If ascending into a temple is, in many faiths, a way to bring congregants physically closer to God, at Punahou, Osipov brings them closer to the ground. God, he seems to suggest, resides not just in the heavens, but in the earth, in the land, and in the water. That's what I did not understand back in 7th grade. A building doesn't make a place sacred. It's the stories we tell about it, the way we care for it, and it cares for us. The Romans had this term genius loci, the spirit of a place. And in Hawaii, that same idea has existed for generations. And it existed, I think, in some small way in my family too. With every tree they planted, my parents were teaching me that we are inextricably linked to the earth, and that link is sacred.